Okay. Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us today. I'm Mark Siegel, founder and CEO of ESG Today, and welcome to day two of our webinar series, which is a collaboration between ESG Today and SE Advisory Services by Schneider Electric. Just let me start once again with a quick housekeeping note before we dive into the session. We're not going to be able to have live Q&A in these sessions, but please feel free to ask questions in the comments section, and your questions will be answered by email. So with that, let's get into it. This seminar series focuses on the foundations of environmental performance, where each day we'll be taking you through different aspects, including measurement of environmental metrics, management of environmental risks and impacts, setting targets to improve environmental performance, and taking action to improve environmental performance. Over the course of the week, we'll explore how these topics relate to each other and provide a roadmap for both future-proofing your sustainability strategy and achieving an A in CDP. So yesterday we looked at measurement, governance, and strategy, and today we are moving on to focus on risk and adaptation. Our speakers will discuss a comprehensive risk management approach that strengthens resilience and explain how it is the foundation of a future-ready sustainability strategy that helps you achieve a CDP A score. And again, today we've got another great jam-packed session. Our speakers today are Anna Milo, a consultant who leads the climate transaction risk scenario analysis at SE Advisory Services North America, who has extensive experience in physical risk analysis. Rachel Bratt, a senior environmental consultant with expertise in both physical and transition climate scenario analyses. Charlotte Hudson, a senior consultant who specializes in climate-related risk assessments and the development of adaptation plans for clients. And Yangfeng Zhao, an expert in climate science and biodiversity risk assessment, who focuses on helping clients bridge the link between climate and nature risks to support sustainable decision-making. So let's get right into it. I'll turn it over to Anna to get us started.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much. And thanks everyone for joining us today. So as Mark mentioned, today we're going to focus on something very central, not only to CDP success, but to resilient businesses and strategies overall, which is risk and opportunity management. And here's what we're going to cover with you today. So first, we'll ground ourselves with the key objectives and definitions, making sure we're aligned on what we mean by climate and nature-related risks, dependencies, and impacts. Second, we'll look at how risks and opportunities management fits into broader environmental performance management and why it's a strategic advantage, not only a compliance requirement. Third, we'll walk through a best-in-class climate, water, and forest risk and opportunity management process, including scenario analysis, financial quantification, and ERM integration aligned to the CDP expectations. And finally, we'll close with how to go further. So with additional services or next steps companies can take to mature their risk resilience strategy. So with that roadmap in mind, let's start with the foundational concepts. Thank you very much. So before we dive deeper into risk, it's worth pausing on why CDP matters and from a risk assessment standpoint. So as you know, CDP manages the world's most comprehensive environmental disclosure system, covering climate, water, and forests. And companies are benchmarked annually, and the scoring is based on what's considered best practice globally, which means the bar rises every single year. So one of the reasons why CDP has become so influential is its ability to stay aligned with evolving framework like IFRS S2, the European ESRS, TNFD, and emerging regulations, which we'll also touch on a little bit later today. So even if your company doesn't currently report to CDP, the approaches we'll walk through today will help you to prepare for this broader regulatory convergence. Now, depending on where you're starting from today, if your company does report CDP, today you'll learn how to meet and exceed the A-list criteria from a risk management perspective, but also how to demonstrate strong performance on dependencies, impacts, and opportunities, and how to align your disclosure with CDP's expectations for scenario analysis, financial quantification, and integration into ERM, as I was mentioning. If your company does not report to CDP, you'll still learn some great things like how to build a best-in-class risk and opportunity process that's useful for beyond reporting. Also, how to build resilience to regulatory and market changes by understanding your exposure, how to embed climate and nature considerations into your strategic planning, something that, as you know, is increasingly required across global markets. So with that in mind, let's take a look in the next step in the next slide to the essential definitions. Thank you very much. So here are the key terms that underpin risk and opportunity management. And understanding how they interact is crucial. So starting with risks, it is defined by the operational, financial, or reputational impact a company may face due to hazards, exposure, or vulnerability. If we're talking about climate, for example, that would include physical risks like extreme weather or transition risk like carbon pricing mechanisms or market shifts. For water and forest, we could be talking about availability, quality, and regulatory constraints, for example. If we're looking at opportunity, on the other hand, these are the potential positive financial impacts. So you could be expecting things like new market access, efficient gains, product innovation, or even access to capital tied to sustainability performance. Dependencies refer to the ecosystem services your organization relies on to function. So when you're thinking about water availability, for example, raw material availability, or climate even regulation. And in terms of impact, these are the positive or negative contributions your company makes to the state of nature. So think, for example, land use change, emissions, or restoration activities. At the bottom part, you'll also see adaptation and mitigation, which are the adjustments to actual and expected impacts of climate change, including physical interventions, operational or strategic changes. You could be talking also about efforts to reduce or prevent GHG emissions. And the resilience is really the outcome we're aiming for. So it's really the ability to withstand, absorb, and even recover from disruptions effectively and efficiently based on the adaptation and mitigation actions. So with that in mind, Mark, back to you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Anna. Just, can you take a minute just looking at the charts, or we're already on the next slide, but if you could just take a look at it, can you just take a minute and explain, how these essential definitions interact? For example, like how do risk and opportunities relate to dependency and impacts, for example?
That is a great question. So when you're thinking about these definitions, one of the key takeaways here is that the dependencies and impacts often drive risks and opportunities. So let's take this example. If your business depends on water availability or forest-based supply chains, for example, those dependencies, they can become risk in stress regions, but they can also unlock opportunities through efficiency, circularity, or even sustainable sourcing. So I think that's a good way to put things and keep that in mind. And I think we're going also to explore this a little bit further in our next section. So it's great having great question. Thank you, Mark.
Okay, thanks. All right, so let's move along, and then let me pass it on to Rachel.
Thank you very much, Anna and Mark. In this next section, we're going to be discussing how environmental performance management is essential for business resilience and a key component of your CDP submission. To manage environmental performance robustly, you need to understand the full ecosystem, your direct operations, your value chain, your dependencies, your impacts, and the risks and opportunities that emerge through them, just as Anna was just explaining in that previous question. It is essential to look beyond climate to water, biodiversity, and forests to effectively understand how environmental risks and opportunities are interdependent and need to be controlled concurrently. A robust risk and opportunity management structure, including all environmental elements, allows companies to mitigate and/or adapt to the changing environmental and regulatory landscape and bolster business resilience. Environmental performance isn't just a sustainability tool anymore. It is essential for business continuity and growth. This year, CDP is aligning with further voluntary and regulatory disclosures and putting even greater emphasis on risk management and adaptation. Improving your CDP score will require environmental risk management to be fully integrated into your enterprise risk management and financial planning processes. The focus of today's session will be on the key components of a best-in-class environmental risk and opportunity management process. But then in tomorrow's session, as we'll see on the next slide, we'll focus on the wider understanding of impacts and dependencies and double materiality across the whole value chain. So if we now move on to why risk and opportunity management matters, we will deep dive into the components of an effective environmental risk and opportunity management process and why it is so important to companies in 2026. This brings us on to why companies do invest and should invest in a structured risk and opportunity management process. Last year, companies reporting to CDP identified 162 billion USD in potential financial losses from supply chain climate-related risks. At the same time, every $1 spent on climate resilience can generate up to $21 in return on investment. But it isn't just about avoiding costs. 55% of companies responding to CDP still aren't offering low carbon or low water impact goods and services, therefore missing out on potential opportunities for revenue and growth. If your risk and opportunity management process is successful, you'll be resilient to risk and have the ability to capitalize on opportunities, making your business inherently resilient and saving you money. If we move on to the next slides, we'll see that having a well-defined, comprehensive risk management process strengthens resilience. As with all risk management, the approach should be an iterative feedback loop and needs to be adaptable to company specificities. Initially, potential risks and opportunities need to be identified, considering operations and geographical location. These identified risks and opportunities are analysed over multiple potential climate scenarios and the assessment of key business processes that might be influenced. Through consideration of the qualitative likelihood and impact, risks and opportunities should be prioritised by relevancy. Identified risks and opportunities should be integrated into your organisation's overall risk management framework, risk owners identified and linked to adaptation and mitigation actions. Potentially material risks and opportunities then need to be financially quantified so the responses to risks can be considered in overall business strategic and financial planning. Charlotte will go into more detail in the following slides in the next section of the risk and opportunity management process. But I'll pass back over to Mark.
Okay, thanks. I mean, clearly, just looking at the slides and just the quick outline that you've described. I mean, it obviously looks like a very involved process for companies. I mean, how long would you say it takes clients to really undertake this work and develop a full environmental risk management process?
You are right, it is a very involved process, but it can absolutely be taken one step at a time. And the expectation isn't that you will go from nothing to having the most in-depth and robust process within a year, for example. The initial process of identification to qualitative inclusion of these risks and opportunities into your enterprise risk management will probably take about 6 months, and then financial quantification taking another few months, but this depends on the risks and opportunities that have been identified and your business's strategic and financial planning cycles. But I think what is most important to understand here is the process should be continuous and iterative, and each year should be building on the previous. So you need to be reviewing what is still relevant, reviewing what needs to be adapted and changed, and continuing to make it more robust and more resilient, as Charlotte will be demonstrating in the next few slides.
Okay, great. So let's pass it on to Charlotte then. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Mark. So yeah, Rachel has already kind of walked us through this iterative feedback loop, but we'll go into a bit more detail here and across the next few slides. So yeah, it all starts with identification, and this needs to consider risks across your company's products, operations, supply chain, financial performance, R&D, as well as different sort of operating regions and geographies to make sure sort of it's undertaken as an organization-wide level and considering all elements of the business. And as this is CDP, and we know it covers sort of climate, water, and forests, I know it's easy to look at this, or especially for several of us, it's easy to look at this from just a climate perspective, but we do need to sort of broaden our lenses a bit and also consider water and sort of forests and nature at this stage, as they're all likely to kind of show risks in different ways, but also interact with each other. So some nature risks, for example, could exacerbate climate risks, or some water risks could exacerbate climate risks, and vice versa. So it's essential that we kind of take this holistic view at this early stage of risk identification to make sure that this kind of interaction and interplay between all of these different risks throughout all of these different processes and operations for a company are considered at the early stage and then assessed throughout this whole loop. So after identification, the next step, if we just jump to the next slide, is scenario analysis. And this is where we need to explore how the world might change and what this might mean for the business, but also the risks that have been identified. So from a climate perspective, this needs to focus on at least one low carbon and one high carbon scenario to ensure the full range of potential future conditions is considered. And this is primarily due to sort of the uncertainty around we don't know which pathway the world is going to follow at this stage, but also because different risks were likely to become material under different conditions. So, for example, under a high carbon scenario, we're more likely to see more material physical risks because the environmental conditions will be more different from today. Whereas under a low carbon scenario, we're likely to see more material transition risks as there'll likely be sort of more stringent regulation in relation to those, which will make them more impactful for companies. And from a water perspective, CDP again expects sort of two scenarios. So this is assessing again sort of different considerations in relation to what water might mean, often linked to climate scenarios. And similarly for forests, they're sort of currently within CDP, the assessment is sort of based on climate-related scenarios and what that might mean in relation to forest-related risks. For example, how might there be a change in the conditions for wildfire, which could obviously be sort of impacting on sort of forest conditions. However, typically from a nature perspective, there aren't specific scenarios from that yet, and it may be that it sort of branches out to that in the future where nature risk goes beyond just considering what the conditions of nature degradation are today, but actually considers how nature may change over time as a result of different climate scenarios. And there is some software out there that can sort of do that assessment, but it's not necessarily integrated into a range of tools yet, but it's where we might see scenario analysis going. And typically, scenario analysis needs to be undertaken every sort of 3 years or so. So again, fits quite nicely into this sort of feedback loop, just to ensure that it remains relevant and up to date and sort of captures any changes in business conditions. And then the next step is prioritization. So using the likelihood and any impacts associated with the assessed risks, it's possible to determine which risks truly matter and require further assessment or more detailed management. Through the outcomes of scenario analysis and thinking about this with all the other information of the risks, it's potentially possible to highlight which ones are likely to be particularly material and need management sort of immediately, and others that may need to be sort of monitored over time just to see if they become material in the future. So even if there are sort of lower priority risks, they can't be ignored for the long term and definitely need sort of consideration of whether or not the conditions change, as we're likely to see changes in all kinds of environmental conditions due to what we're doing to the world. So an important point to make sure that we keep monitoring them. And these risks, once they've been sort of prioritized, should be considered alongside other risks considered by the business and be integrated into the wider risk management process. So this next step on the next slide, this integration involves integrating environmental risks into the same framework that your organization uses for more traditional risks, if you like, the sort of the operational, the financial, the strategic risks. And doing this can make sure that sort of the overall risk management framework is more enhanced. There's more preparedness for uncertainties, just sort of greater alignment with regulatory reporting, improved value chain resilience, and overall sort of improved strategic decision making as we're considering all of these different types of risks alongside the more traditional risks that are typically included within the ERM process. And this step is sort of increasingly crucial to making sure that the risks are given the consideration that they need, because economic damages from climate risks on their own has probably been underestimated for many, many decades. So doing this will make sure that that kind of importance is given to them in the same way as it's given to other risks. And with that in mind, the next step is the financial quantification. So this involves estimating the costs and in some cases, sort of costs of impacts and cost of adaptation measures, but primarily, especially what CDP asks for, is the sort of the cost of the response itself. So what does the adaptation actually cost a company to implement? The key thing that CDP asks for is what is the cost of the risk. Adaptation is a later step, but we're sort of anticipating that CDP might ask some questions on that in more detail this year. But in terms of estimating potential costs from the risks, this requires information on sort of current business costs and the potential risk over time. So pulling in from that scenario analysis how the impact is likely to change over time. And these are combined to give indicative costs under different future conditions. So for example, one that's sort of easiest to think about, I think, is the potential changes in operational costs due to changes in energy use, for example, due to increased occurrence of heat waves. There's likely to be more days where you need more air conditioning, and that'll be sort of more energy related costs for a business. And it's important to really sort of place any costs that are modeled against any financial materiality thresholds. So making sure that if that threshold is crossed, it's definitely considered in financial planning, but also worth considering whether adapting to that risk in that case can sort of therefore mean it is reduced below that financial materiality threshold, and therefore is a helpful strategic decision for an organization. And this brings us into the final step, I suppose, which is integration into financial planning. And this is the part that's often sort of skipped, or often sort of an afterthought, if you like, after this whole process, because more often than not, I think we're seeing organizations identify that many risks maybe aren't financially material yet. So this bit is sort of only the case for a few risks, and it's sort of creeping more and more into what companies need to do. But this is where we need to kind of bring in that financial quantification to help sort of shape strategy, financial planning, product development decisions, procurement decisions, R&D investment, and ultimately sort of transition planning, to make sure that it's all feeding back into sort of overall business planning and making that more resilient where possible. And this again should bring in the concept of sort of interdependencies and interplay across not only different business areas, but also the different risks that need to be considered across climate, water, and forests, and how they may kind of interact and all occur in either all at once, or maybe they'll occur independently. But that kind of consideration needs to be given to the risks that are assessed to fully make this as a resilient a process as possible. And this brings us back to the start of the feedback loop. So once this assessment has been done once, it should sort of form the basis of future assessments. As I said, it's sort of scenario analysis typically undertaken every 3 years. And I think this process should sort of be reviewed on a more annual basis to make sure that nothing's sort of changing too significantly. If there are any new risks, they can be sort of considered sooner, but then a full reiteration of the scenario analysis is sort of every 3 years. And then on the next slide, we just have a bit of a focus on adaptation, as this, I think, is something that's going to be increasingly important in CDP this year. There are going to be some new questions on that, and sort of what adaptation measures are implemented, which are effective, and whether they're high quality. So just wanted to deep dive on this a bit and highlight. So Anna's already introduced us to the concept of adaptation, but yeah, it's the process of sort of adjustment to actual or expected impacts of climate change, including physical interventions, so the sort of traditional flood defenses that you can imagine, operational strategic changes, which might help to manage reputational risks, for example, or people resilience at sites during climate events, and then ultimately sort of efforts to reduce or prevent greenhouse gas emissions. So that kind of mitigation piece can also be considered within this wider bucket. And within the risk equation, typically we have exposure to the hazard or event, and the vulnerability to that hazard or event as well, which gives us the overall risk element. But what adaptation does is it can target primarily the vulnerability, but in some cases, particularly in sort of forest and nature cases, it can also impact the exposure to these risks. So it can kind of ultimately lead to hopefully a reducing spiral within this risk equation. And ultimately, I think the main sort of sell for adaptation comes in when we look at financial impact. So if the financial impacts have been quantified and they're across the materiality threshold for a particular company, it's considering whether action to adapt to that can reduce that below the materiality threshold. And I think more often than not, the answer to that will be it will be a sensible financial decision. But yeah, case by case basis. So with that, back to you, Mark.
Thanks, Charlotte. If I could just stick on adaptation for another minute, just because, like you said, I mean, it is becoming more important in CDP. I can tell you personally, I'm hearing, writing, and just reading about it a lot more, just in the last few months than I ever was. So it might be interesting just to dive into it a little bit. To what extent would you say that companies are almost already implementing climate adaptation measures when they're not even labeling them as such? The stuff that companies are already doing. Like, have you seen this from your clients?
Yes, yeah, we do see this. We often have discussions with sort of site managers or operation owners within part of our risk assessment, looking at the vulnerability piece to kind of understand what's already in place at certain sites to deal with various climate risks. And more often than not, the response is like, oh yeah, we upgraded our aircon system yesterday to make sure it can account for sort of higher temperatures in the future. And it's immediately like, well, there you go, you're sort of already considering that higher temperature. I think there's still maybe a slight jump between increasing sort of capacity of air conditioning systems, for example, for temperatures that have already been reached, as opposed to temperatures that are going to be reached. So there's a bit of a step in terms of adapting to conditions today versus what we might expect in the future. But I think, yeah, more often than not, especially with things like infrastructure upgrades, they're already being sort of designed in new buildings or designed in sort of maintenance cycles and stuff like that. So it's definitely something that we're already seeing within projects and engagement with our clients.
And from like the perspective of a sustainability team, in terms of identifying existing actions, if they want to show their leadership that investing in climate resilience is already delivering returns, are you seeing this as when they were trying to convince their teams that that it's worth it, like is you know trying to figure out how to phrase this, but like how can the sustainability teams identify these actions to really convince their companies?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it all comes back down to kind of the financial piece and whether or not there's a visible saving. For example, maybe year on year, once a change has been implemented, can we kind of see that there's a benefit there, or even just kind of peer reviews, seeing what others are doing in the space. That's quite a good way of kind of showing, this has had a beneficial effect elsewhere, and it would be relevant for our sites for ABC reasons, I think is a good place to start. There are, as I say, much more coming out, and hopefully after see this CDP this year, when companies have to kind of demonstrate where they're doing adaptation, there may be even bigger databases of sort of possible actions or things that are being taken by various companies to provide the evidence needed for that.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's just becoming like so relevant now. Thank you. All right, so let me pass it along to Young Fun, and she'll take us through the rest of the session.
Great, thanks, Mark. Hello, everyone. In the following slide, we're going to look at how CDP's A-list expectation for the risk and opportunity disclosure align with the major frameworks we list here. So across the top, you will see there are 6 frameworks, and down the left, you will list the dimensions we mentioned before. Here we have few points to stand out. Firstly, for the ESIS, the companies should note that ESIS expects a deeper double maturity analysis, scenario analysis, and financial quantification analysis. And the CDP and IFIS S2 are also strongly aligned, especially it comes to the risk identification and scenario analysis. CDP disclosure is more flexible than the IFIS, especially regarding the EIM integration and the quantitative assessments. For the GRI is more focused on the impact accountability. CDP goes further for the environmental risk, strategy, and performance. For the TFD expects the deeper location based analysis and also the integration into the decision making, so that is the area where more mature companies often need the additional effort for this part. For the SB261 is largely covered by the CDP's A-list, with only a minimum additional work framing needs. And finally, for the TCFD and the CDP is almost fully aligned. So it means that there's no extra effort required here. So hope it's clearly for you. And with that, Mark, it's to you for this slide.
Great. So let me just ask you a quick question. Just looking at the slide, something that I think kind of jumps out at the table is like, it sort of sticks out that aligning with TNFD requires significant effort for A-listers to identify and prioritize risks. Like, why would you say that is? And what kind of analysis do you think is necessary for TNFD? Like, and how can that be done?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Actually, the ISSB International Sustainability Standard Board had begun standard setting for the natural-related disclosure. So it means that the biodiversity and the ecosystem impact are becoming the core components of the corporate reporting. So TFD requires significant effort because it asks companies to understand where their operation intersection with the nature and how they depend on the ecosystem service and also how they impact the biodiversity and the nature. So there's something most companies have never assessed at scales, especially the nature is location specific and highly complex. It depends on the local ecosystem. It depends on the biome, species, and the ecological process. So TFD is built around the LEAP approach, LEAP. This is the approach that's a structured assessment method that requires four steps. The first one is locate. This asks companies to identify where your business interact with nature. And then the second step is evaluate. This will be ask company to assess your dependence on the ecosystem service, which you rely on, and also the impact, the pressure your activity should have on the nature and biodiversity. And the third step is the assess. It means determine your natural-related risk and opportunities. And then the last step the TFD asks is prepare, develop the adaptation solution for the disclosure of the TFD. So many companies are beginning with internal LEAP pilot by using the available tools, which recommended by the TFD. So you will find the list of the platform, the tools in the TFD website directly. Hope it's clear for you, Mark.
Okay, thanks. So I think that takes us down toward towards the end of our session. I don't know if anyone else has anything left that they want to add, but those were really great presentations. Okay, so I think that takes us down to the end. Thanks again for another great session. I'd like to thank especially Anna. Oh, sorry, are we still going?
Yeah, sorry. We have a last slide here to present.
Sorry about that. Sorry, I skipped over that one. I apologize.
No worries. So here's the one slide we would like to present to you to help you to understand where you and what your next step should be. So basically, at the early stage, the companies typically begin with training and workshops. This will help team to build a good understanding of climate and the natural risk. And then next, we move to the risk identification, which means mapping both the transition and physical risk for climate, for nature, that could impact operation or the value chains. And this step creates the foundation of the structured risk management. At a more advanced stage, companies conduct the climate scenario analysis as well. So here, they test the resilience of their business under the different temperature scenarios and under the different time horizons. So there's many software tools can be used in this step. And most advanced companies may use bespoke scenarios as well for the climate scenario analysis. From there, companies process to the financial quantification analysis and prepare the action planning as well. This involves the translates the identified risk into the transition impact and also integrates them into the strategic decision. So finally, companies develop the full action plan adaptation strategy. This includes the set level vulnerability assessment, evaluation of the adaptation effectiveness, and the targeted intervention like hotspot analysis for the water, for the deforestation, for climate and natural physical risk. So overall, hope this curve can help you to have clearly ideas for your next step. So this is the last slide for my part, and back to you, Mark.
Thanks, Fang. Sorry, I'll mark my page numbers a little better for tomorrow. Okay, so anyways, yeah. So as I was saying, thanks for a great session, guys. I especially like to thank Anna, Rachel, Charlotte, Youngfang for taking us through the second session in this week's series. Again, we really hope to see everyone back here at the same time tomorrow. We'll have another great panel taking us through value chain management. So again, please remember to leave your questions in the comments section and they'll be answered by email. And just again, a reminder that the seminar recordings will be shared with you via email. So again, thanks again, everyone, so much. And we'll see you tomorrow for part 3.